Okay, so now you're going to finally find out what a norm is. So this is, I should say before we start, that the problems with the inevitable problems with the presentation are compensated for with the fact that there isn't, unusually for me, an actual paper here, which I'll send to the project team, but if anybody else wants it, let me know. And so, I guess following on from the logic of Tony's presentation, what the five of us, Tony and Philipp are here, and Kyoungmi Kim and Olga Tregaskis are not, what we're trying to do is to address, as Tony said, processes of global norm-making concerning the nature of work within multinationals. And what the paper tries to do is, by investigating 4 cases of global norm-making activity across 2 multinationals, where we've done large numbers of interviews, we try to develop a framework for analysing the relations between formal and informal elements of that international global norm-making process. And even before Gregor asked, I thought that up front, it might be useful to give you some idea of what we actually meant by global norm-making. So I thought it would be useful to very briefly outline at the outset, if you like, the 4 cases that were taking the development of our framework from. So they're in 2 companies. So case 1 and 2 are both from a large IT and telecommunications firm based in the UK. And cases 3 and 4 come from a large business services consultancy. So case 1 refers really to a change in a functional HR policy. So the revision of a global management system intended partly to simplify the system and partly to move somewhat away from the deleterious effects, from the bad effects of the previous use of force distribution, which in turn had something to do with the relation between performance management and a no compulsory redundancies policy that the company still has in the home country of the UK. So that, in a sense, in relation to the HR literature, is a relatively conventional thing. It's a change of policy. It's a change of global policy. Case 2 in the same firm, rather than being a policy, is about the way in which an internationally distributed work group is coordinated. So for those of you who heard me and Philipp present over in Kyoto, this refers to the woman that I referred to as Kate, who's going to come up for the rest of my career, so you might as well get used to it.
She doesn't know that.
She doesn't know anything about this, no. Briefly, Kate, working from home in the southern United States, coordinates a work group based on a specific client contract, consisting mainly of workers based at service centres in India and in Colombia, and they've never met, she's never travelled to either India or Colombia, etc. So what is being managed virtually, but globally here or internationally here, are the basic norms of work organisation: who's supposed to do what, where, when, basic things about the informal work culture of the group, and broadly speaking, the wage effort bargain in general, at its local level. So it's just taking stuff that used to happen at the level of local work groups and messing that idea up geographically, in a sense. Case 3 in the consultancy concerns the development of a new competency framework consisting of a set of 10 global core competencies, some of which were restated and reinterpreted from earlier iterations of similar things, while others were completely new, such as global acumen, and how these are translated both literally. There's an issue of literal translation of the framework into languages other than English, but also, of course, figuratively translated in different national and regional contexts. So again, it's a framework. It's something a bit less formal than your performance management policy, but it's clearly a set of norms that are supposed to strongly affect HR. And case 4 in one business unit of the same firm is an attempt to generate a higher degree of consistency across borders in what they call the proactivity of staff in relating to clients. So proactivity concerned how staff approached clients and provided standardized services to them. And it involved essentially raising the awareness of staff in one country of developments in another, so that they could engage in cross-flow selling, so proactively highlighting other services that the client may be interested in. As I may come on to, one of the interesting things about this case is that the people who are most charged with taking forward the norm are not particularly senior. They're a middle management, below kind of partner level, so they can't simply drive the norm through hierarchy. There's other things have to happen. So we're using global norm making, as opposed to other words we might have used, like HR policies or whatever, to try to capture more fully the scale and variety of attempts within multinationals to coordinate ways of working across borders. So these attempts may happen through formal HR policies, the HR literature talks about more or less well, but that's missing a whole load of kind of HR and work and employment related action, in the sense that these attempts at norm making may also happen through a whole range of other mechanisms. And in a way, this is the first point we want to make kind of in itself, really, that most research on the international diffusion of organizational policies and practices in multinationals kind of draws, as said, on neo-institutional theory, relying on measures in attempts to come up with something that's quantifiable, relying on measures such as institutional duality, country institutional profiles, with the American journals, this is what's published, to examine how multinationals and their subsidiaries resolve problems of dual legitimacy with institutional environment, with their institutional environments, their external institutional environments, and with the MNC itself. And we argue that this focus on formal home-to-host transfer fails to provide a convincing picture of international norm-making activity in multinationals. And this is for, I guess, 2 main reasons. First, as we've already intimated, I think, the integration of multinationals doesn't only occur through the transfer of formal policies and practices, but also through a range of normative control mechanisms which are commonly less formal in nature. And additionally, formal policies are usually dependent on informal processes, including personal or social forms of control across borders. And both myself and Tony have recently gone back to old mentor Anthony Ferner's work in Journal of Management Studies in 2000 on Formality, Informality, which is a somewhat neglected paper, but is very, very instructive in this regard. The second point is that the transfer literature assumes, in order to be operationalized, that national subsidiary units are central organizing structures within the firm through which potential global policies must travel. This plays down the fact that many firms, and certainly most of the firms which we've got access to in the UK part of this project, don't really operate like that. They operate in what approximate to international network structures. We're aware, but we're obviously aware both of the kind of conventional international management work on international networks, but also if you read Global Production Network theory, read Dickens, something like that, we're aware that that kind of national vision, this kind of Westphalian vision of the multinational, it doesn't always apply. Equally, in many multinationals, and again, many of the multinationals that we're encountering, real-time collaboration across borders is not a rare thing. It's an everyday fact of working life. It's what people do. People spend their lives on Skype. So these routinized and operational interactions across borders mean that an increasingly wide pool of staff have significant international interactions. So our pool of globalizing actors is much larger than simply looking at international managers or simply looking at people who are hierarchically charged with moving things from the headquarters to the subsidiary. So a really substantial number of both managers, but also team leaders and and professionals have some degree of authority over staff not based in their own country of work. Meaning that if we're talking about international management, we're talking about the individuals involved in international management who have some agency in how norms move around. We need to look at a whole lot of people. They're not easy to find. We have to. It's a substantial part of the research is working out who they are. So essentially, we're trying to integrate the analysis of different forms of global norm making relating to the management of work. So having initially identified a tension between formality and informality, we then tried to identify dimensions of that formality and informality, and we come up provisionally with four. Two of which relate to substance and two of which relate to process. So first we look at codification. So, and I think this is in a sense the simplest one. Where a norm is highly codified, the ways in which it's intended to affect the behaviours and choices of actors is clearly expressed in a way that's intended to minimise ambiguity. The HR literature on international transfer tends to assume that what is being transferred consists of these formalized policies, and at least implicitly that these are relatively codified in nature. But while multinationals may attempt to use highly codified norms to manage their international workforces by precisely specifying what needs to be done to achieve a certain performance target or something like that, our framework doesn't assume that this is always the case. So some norms, even those designed by powerful hierarchical actors, may be intentionally vague in their codification. So mission statements, things like that, clearly intended to affect people's behaviours, but provide more of a framework within which actors attempt to illustrate how their behaviours comply with and advance organisational norms, rather than providing precise instructions to follow in all circumstances. Obviously, codification is even more difficult where norms are developed by people who lack hierarchical power, especially where a local or workgroup norm collides with senior management's interests. Secondly, this is probably the bit we've had the longest discussions about, to succeed in governing behaviours, a norm requires some sort of enforcement. So enforcement we can see as more formal when the consequences of obeying or disobeying the norm are clear. So, you'll get fired if you do something unacceptable, or you'll receive a certain bonus if you do a specific thing. And obviously enforcement can be seen as less formal when the consequences are unclear. As a subject of the norm, doing certain things will meet with approval or disapproval, but you don't know the precise consequences of this. Now, this informality does not mean weakness. So informality and the sanctions for not complying with certain norms can be very effective from senior management's viewpoints, and we've got this in many of our norming cases. A notion that something good or something seriously bad will happen can be much more effective than specifying exactly what. So too much precision in this respect may be difficult and consequently lack credibility. We then, because I'm running out of time, I'll increase my speed. look at two things to do with process. First is to do with platforms. This comes from Finnemore and Sticking Circle norms that Tony referred to. So we're talking about what the organizational platform through and which norms are promoted is. So within large multinationals, the platforms that we know about are the orthodox organizational structures, such as established national and regional hierarchies, or support functions, such as international HR functions. And we're aware of the processes, obviously, of the process of bureaucratization, and how these offer benefits to norm makers by reducing uncertainty and providing some degree of kind of quasi-constitutional clarity. However, they may lack flexibility, may not be the fastest way of dealing with emergent issues. And so even actors who do have the power and authority advantages of hierarchy often seek to apply their norms through less structured platforms. So these include the whole range of things that come up in modern or postmodern management: the transnational working parties, task forces, the appointment of local champions, which one of my former employers used to love, outside standard hierarchical structures. Now, these less structured platforms remain somewhat formal in the sense that the membership of such groups is generally in the gift of managers with hierarchical authority, but they're often designed as temporary structures and are often designed to bypass standard bureaucratic actors such as senior subsidiary appointees. And finally, for actors without the advantages of hierarchy, platforms are likely to be even more structured. Work groups may well create their own norms, but must rely to a much greater extent on informal mechanisms, persuasion, the use of moral threats, the use of individual skills in framing, etc., to take forward their ideas. And finally, the aggregation. This we can, I think, talk about very quickly because it kind of links in with what Tony was talking about the difference between a norm and an institution. Obviously, norms generally emerge in contested arenas where they're likely to have to relate to other norms and other perceptions of interest. So you need to fit your norm within a constellation of norms, which are creating what Thurborn refers to as institutional norm complexes. And again, this may happen in kind of relatively formal or relatively informal ways, but existing research shows that it's rarely exclusively a formal process. There's no kind of quasi-constitution normally that works out how all these norms are supposed to actually interact with each other. So norm makers can attempt to work out the relations between different norms formally, but less formal processes by which actors on the ground interpret what happens when norms designed for different purposes intersect or collide are probably inevitable in most cases. And because I've run out of time, we'll just see that I won't talk through this in detail, but applying those kind of criteria for formality and informality across our four norms and two companies, you get obviously a range of you kind of get a range of higher or lower scores on codifiability, on the formality of codification, the formality of incentives to compliance, formality of platforms, and the formality of aggregation. And I guess our next task is to kind of work out some of the independent variables affecting the difference between those, but we've not done that yet.
Okay. Well, Phil, thank you very much. And